I won this plant at Flower Club last night. I thought it was a chrysanthemum, and then I looked at it closely this morning and read the label, and it's an Aster aggeratoides. There you go. And it's a dwarf variety. So I am going to plant it in the flower bed, although it breaks my golden rules of only wanting to grow tall flowers so I can cut them and enjoy them indoors. Hello there and welcome back to my garden. I've had my garden now for a year and it's proving to be quite hard work. Now, if you're a novice gardener like me, I would love it if you would consider subscribing to my channel. All you need to do is to tap the button marked subscribe, and that means next time you open the YouTube app on your phone, your tablet or your computer, one of my videos will be waiting for you. So as well as planting my aster out in the garden today, I'm also going to be planting the single Achillea, the yarrow, which my sister has been growing for me. She had huge success with Cosmos. I reckon 100% of the seeds resulted in plants, but this is the only plant that's developed from the seed, from the whole packet of seeds she grew for me. And do we need to talk about bindweed? Now that I've done a really good overhaul of my husband's side of the garden, which meant dragging out all the bindweed, I am on bindweed watch every morning. And it's much easier to keep under control when you can be doing little and often. But I've fallen into the mistake of trying to pick it out with my fingers. And I discovered you really need to dig deep with a small garden fork. If you've really allowed your bindweed to take hold, you can literally just pull clumps off your plants. But the problem with doing that is that you risk damaging your plants. So what I've been trying to do is to nip it in the bud, so to speak. And as I went through, discovering that if I pinched the leaves off, I wasn't dragging up any of the root. So I have got my small handheld garden fork and having to dig down and then pick up all these spaghetti-like roots. My husband, who is the font of all knowledge, tells me that even if I leave the tiniest bit of root in there, it will spring back and I'll get even more bindweed growth. So what I'm trying to do is to build my bindweed watch into my regular routine. So when I make a cup of tea in the morning and walk the grounds, I'm having a look for the bindweed with my handheld trowel in hand, just trying to keep on top of things. And then shall we talk about bulbs too? I've decided to leave my daffodil bulbs and tulip bulbs in the garden, but the bulbs I planted in containers were just getting waterlogged. So I want to make sure I can save them so I can plant them out into my containers next year too. I thought perhaps I could dry them in the sunshine, but my husband had some advice for me. He said this is what Monty Don does. And I'm not quite sure whether it is what Monty Don does, or whether it's just my husband trying to underscore the fact that he does know what he's talking about. And of course, he is my go-to gardening guru. His advice wasn't to keep my bulbs in a container drying in the sunshine. He suggested that I laid them all out on a piece of newspaper in my workshop and let them dry out then, and then make sure I put them into paper bags with the name of the bulbs written on them. So I need to make sure I get on with that, making sure I've got two separate piles so I know what it is I've got. Well, I know they're tater-tate and great hyacinths, but I want to make sure that when I plant them, they are in two separate containers and I don't end up with a mixed bowl of flowers. A week or so ago, we had quite a prolonged period of rain, and I've been meaning to tip these containers out for absolutely months, and I've just never got round to it. So I've got these little metal pans, they're cake tins, and I've chosen them because they look lovely, but they don't have any drainage holes in them. I'm loath to put drainage holes in them, because I thought I might actually want to use them as flower arranging containers, in which case they would need to be watertight. So as the sun has come out, I've tipped them out onto my patio table and I'm just sorting through, so making a pile of compost and then a pile of bulbs to put out to dry. I bought some flowers in the week from a local flower grower, Country Lane Flowers, a couple of miles from me. And the business is run by one of my friends, Sue. She very kindly delivered the flowers to me. I invited her in for a cup of tea and she had a look at my growing patch. Now I have decided, for all my joking about being a flower farmer, quite clearly I'm not a flower farmer. I don't want to be a flower farmer, but what I really want is to have a full herbaceous border so I can cut my flowers to enjoy them in vases indoors. And Sue gave me a little bit of advice, probably harsh, but fair. One of the first things she said was, if it isn't working, get rid of it. So these sluggeat and cosmos just aren't going to recover. They need to come out. On the other hand, she was rather admiring of my borage, so that made me feel good. And you'll notice that I've chopped down my foxgloves. Sue said not to allow them to self-seed in this part of the garden, but to shake the seeds elsewhere. And you'll notice as well that I've trimmed back my bay, which grows so fast. Now, Sue had more words of advice, and she said that when she visited Dixter, Christopher Lloyd said, just do what you need to do when you want to do it. Don't wait for the right time. So that's what I've done. Just chopped off the tall spikes of new growth, just to keep the bay under control, because I know if I don't keep it under control, very quickly it'll be 3 metres tall and it's really going to overshadow the garden. Do you remember I told you about Delphinium number 2? I've got some new growth on Delphinium number 1. Sue says the slugs love them, don't bother next year. Sue then asked me for a trowel and she dug little sample holes in my garden, and she's declared that I've got compacted clay soil underneath my beds and really I need to be mulching heavily. And notice the azalea, or is it a rhododendron? This has been moved from our front garden and half-heartedly replanted it. And of course she's noticed that it needs watering and hasn't been planted sufficiently deep. Can you see? The root ball is standing proud of the beds. Now, neither my husband or myself particularly like this plant, so that's another job to think about. Do I dig it up and put it on the compost heap, or do I dig it up and plant a deeper hole and then mulch properly around it? And more bad news for my plant selection and location. Sue advised me that my zinnias are never going to survive where I've planted them. They are far too shaded by the maple that overhangs this part of the garden. I tried to convince her that we get lots of evening sunshine as this part of the garden is west facing. She wasn't convinced. And as she was here, I asked Sue why my stinking hellebores hadn't flowered. Her first question was, when did I transplant them? I said in the winter. She said, you need to give them another year to establish and they should be in flower next year. And as you can see, I've planted some phlox in between them. I bought those at the market in town this week. And for more instant gardening, I bought 3 Rebecca's. And when I turned them over, pots were really root bound. The roots were coming out at the end of the pot. So I think that's something I need to think about next time I buy plants, is I was just picking the ones that had lots of buds on them, but perhaps I should have run my hand underneath the pot or turn the pot over so I could see what state the roots were in. So I ended up scraping the roots off from the outside of the pot and then really being quite firm with them once I'd unpotted it, in the hope that they are going to spread out and establish in the ground. Sue was admiring of my teasel though, so I did get 1 gold star. If you watched last week's video, you'll know that this was drooping over the path, and I was telling my husband how great it was that suddenly it righted itself, and what I hadn't noticed to begin with, he's stuck a stake next to it, so it's up and off the path now. It's just starting to come into flower, and I've noticed this morning there was a goldfinch in the garden, and they particularly enjoy feasting on the seeds of the teasel, but it is a killer flower if you want to use it in flower arranging. And while the stake that my husband used to prop up the teasel is quite inconspicuous, I don't like the way that my lavender has been propped up. It just looks so unnatural. So to stop it spilling onto the path, I'm actually going to cut it back, and eventually I'm going to replant this first plant that's next to the path a bit further back into the beds. If you'd like to know more about the best time to harvest your lavender for drying and how to dry it, I'll leave a couple of links to some videos in the description under this one. So I'm going to lift out that metal stake and get my scissors out. It will make me feel a little bit like a flower farmer, bringing in my harvest of lavender. Oh, it smells lovely. So here goes. I could either cut to stem by stem or just get handfuls at a time. I think that's what I'm going to do. Acknowledge that I may well be sacrificing some of the flowers. I want to get the bush back to a rounded form with no overhanging of the flower bed. I'll just do this first section and then leave the rest of the lavender for the bees to enjoy. Not a bad bunch, eh? So thank you so much for joining me in the garden today. And if you've got any comments or advice for me, please do let me know in the comments. That's all for me for now, and I'll see you in the garden next time. This is just absolutely delicious. I need to find an elastic band now. Have you noticed that quite often they get dropped in the street when your post is delivered? I always pick them up and put them in my pocket. I'll be hanging this up on the peg rail in my kitchen so it can dry out of direct sunlight, as well as looking beautiful in the process. Thank you so much for joining me in the garden today, and if you've got any comments on how you control your bindweed, do let me know. That's all for me for now, and I'll see you next time.